So my name is Charlotte Horlyck, and I lecture in Korean art history in the Department of History of Art and Archaeology. For first-year students and for students who have been outside the academic environment for a while, my advice would be for them to make use of the Learning, Teaching, Development support, the Student Welfare Office, the various library sessions and so on. And there really is a huge amount of support available for students on all sorts of different levels, right from personal skills to relaxation skills to how to write essays, how to find things in the library and so on and so on. And perhaps initially it can all seem very overwhelming, but perhaps really try to sit down and consider what would be useful for me. When do I have time to attend the various sessions? And really, I guess, get into the system. Because I guess sometimes students will perhaps not make use of those services until it's perhaps at a very, very crucial point, or perhaps not necessarily when it's too late, but when in principle they could have made use of it earlier and could have averted certain disasters later on. When it comes to when I advise students to seek out help from LTD, often it's in connection with their written assignments. Again, because when you see students in class and I lecture, they may have give feedback in terms of when we have discussion sessions and so on and so on. But at times it can be very difficult to estimate which students have got different kinds of problems unless they themselves say something. For example, the quiet students can be the ones who write absolutely excellent essays. The very verbal ones can be the ones that find it very difficult to structure their essays and so on and so on, or the ones that perhaps have got a big problem with time management, or the ones that completely crumble when they sit exams. But unfortunately, you don't really know that until it's happened. What I do try to do at the beginning of a lecture is that sometimes on the PowerPoint, I will say, these are the key issues that I would like you to think about in today's lecture. Sometimes I will say, if you walk away from today's lecture knowing why X artist produce this particular type of work at this particular time, you're completely fine. You've understood what I'll be trying to convey over the next 2 hours. Ultimately, I think it's about finding your own way and accepting that there are different ways to do things as long as you are willing to explore. I have considered this issue of increasingly all of us use computers so much, and we get used to writing on a computer. Many of us write very fast without having been taught how to type. I mean, that's kind of an outmoded thing, right? And I guess less and less of us use handwritten notes. And I have thought about, in particular, the younger generation of students who have been brought up using computers also during their secondary, college years and so on. I think it must be quite frustrating suddenly having to write pages up and pages down by hand in an exam situation. I think in particular, I actually tried it the other day whilst working on my book, because I got a bit tired of always sitting in front of the computer and you're always faced with this sort of blank page and always trying to write something and you delete it and you write it again and you delete it. And I thought maybe it would be liberating simply writing by hand so that it's more difficult to delete. And that was actually a very interesting experience. Also because I came across some of my own drafts from when I was undergraduate student that of course are all handwritten. And it's really interesting to see how I had written pages up, pages down by hand, and how little I had actually deleted. So, and I wonder whether writing on a computer generates a completely, or not, perhaps not completely, but how writing on the computer generates a different form of thinking, in particular because we get so used to the delete button and the copy and paste button. And I'm not sure actually if it's a good thing. The individual lecturer has a lot of responsibility to write feedback that is easily decipherable and that can be turned into something concrete that is better than what it was before. And I use the marking criteria that's published by our faculty. And in some cases I actually more or less copy and paste the different wording that is published on that criteria, so that students, I guess, can see exactly where they are, right? Because the wording, of course, changes from, say, the 50s to the 60s to the 70s and so on. So actually that's one thing I do use very actively. I always have that page up next to the Moodle page when I do the marking. But in terms of other feedback that the students can use constructively, one thing I did do one year was that I distributed to the group 2 of the best essays that had been handed in, the ones that got, I think, 73 and 74, something like that. And it seems that the students really benefited from that. Because I think one problem is, especially if for those students who continuously get, say, 58, in the low 50s, in the low 60s, it can be very difficult to know what is a good essay. And of course I can say to that student, go and read an article and then you'll see what is a good piece of writing. But an academic article that's been published in some peer-reviewed journal is of course on a completely different scale than as a second year's undergraduate essay. And I think it can be very difficult to relate to that. And I wonder whether that's perhaps something to make more use of. In particular, MA students want clearer and clearer guidelines as to exactly what is expected of them in order to achieve good grades. And I think there are different ways in which that can be delivered. In particular, of course, in my department, a large percentage of the mark is based on written coursework, essays in particular. So I think the individual lecturer can tell the students the basics really in terms of how to write a good essay. But of course, at that level, before the students have submitted anything, it becomes rather theoretical. Because you can of course really tell them only, I guess, really the basics. Make sure you have a good structure, make sure you reference your sources. In our case here in the Department of History of Art and Archaeology, make sure you include illustrations and so on and so on. But what I try to do to tell the students at both undergraduate and MA level is, I guess, to give them experience from past years and say to them, this particular, an essay that was very clear in its deliverables, with a very clear structure that, for example, focused on a relatively narrow aspect, they tend to get better marks than the ones that try to discuss everything in a relatively short essay. So some of those, I guess, advice like that comes before the essay has been handed in. Do you want to continue?
If you've got anything else.
Right. Well, because I think what's really very, in terms of how the individual lecturer can support the student once they have submitted the essay, I think now that the Moodle site has a very important function in that, because we have to write the comments. So not only do we have to, well, it's up to in our department, it's up to the individual lecturer how many comments they embed within the text. But we all have to write a continuous paragraph, I guess, where we evaluate that particular essay. And in terms of our MA essays, the second marker also has to write his or her comments on the essay. So the students can very clearly see, certainly at MA level, 2 different readers' comments on their essay. I've found what I've tried to do, and again, that's from past experience and so on, is that I try to be encouraging in my evaluations, because I think it's very important not to discourage the students, actually, irrespective of their mark. But of course, I also have to state what was less good about the essay, so that they understand why they got the mark they did. And that at times actually can be quite difficult, especially with the good essays that get, say, a mark of 68 or 69 or say 70. And it was a comment, the reason why I've been more and more aware of this was because one of our external examiners a couple of years ago, who was the external examiner for our undergraduate program, he said that having read a broad spread of our comments, he felt that there was a lot of positive response on the essays, but that it tended to be rather generic. So simply just from reading the comments, it was difficult to assess whether that particular essay had got a 61 or a 69, because they were all along the line, say, of very good structure, this or this or this, that. And he very much encouraged us also to write the weaker points. And that is actually a lot more difficult. So I really try to focus also on that, whilst not, of course, being overly harsh, but try to say, I feel that if you had focused more on this, you should have been able to have gone more into depth on this particular issue, which I think is really crucial to this particular argument, or something along those lines. And in particular, one year actually, I had a very, very good student, but he was dyslexic, and he had sometimes, I think he spent a lot of time on his essays, and he made a lot of use on the learning and teaching services and so on. And he was somewhat a borderline 70. But he was very ambitious, and I thought I really wanted to encourage him. I remember one particular essay where I had written comments really trying to focus not only on the strong points but also on the weaker points, and giving advice on what he can do for the next essay. And he wrote back and said that was very, very useful, and saying that he felt it had really helped him to shape his second essay. And I think ultimately I look at it like that my comments will hopefully be a springboard for that student in order to get better marks for their second, third, fourth essays. When you ask me that question in terms of what can students expect from SOAS, I get taken back. When I started my undergraduate degree at SOAS, I did my MA degree, I did my PhD degree here. So I've been at SOAS, I guess, for a long time, not continuously, but I've seen a lot of changes at SOAS, I feel, in terms of the student body and so on. But I think ultimately still, I guess, a student can expect the same environment in terms of being at a place where being immersed and being fascinated by something that is generally seen to be unusual is actually the norm. And I think that's often mentioned again and again, that SOAS is a place where you feel included. And I think where you're not necessarily asked, oh, why do you study Japanese, or why are you interested in Chinese food or something other like that, but where it's completely normal to be fascinated by cultures, societies outside Europe or outside the West. And I think that's really, really special. I guess if one puts it more broadly, SOAS is, to a certain extent, perhaps a little bit insular, in the sense that what we do doesn't necessarily easily form part of social expectations and so on, in terms of it is rather specialized, but that's exactly what makes it very special. And I think that's also really what attracts students and academics, a broader community actually, to SOAS. And I think that's also probably why once people encounter SOAS, they don't want to leave it. That I think the alumni body is also very, very strong, and that we see these alumni societies being formed outside the UK, because SOAS students have such a strong bonding experience.